"Sir, could you please give up your seat for a more important passenger?" The voice drifted through the first-class cabin, soft as a whisper, yet sharp enough to tear through the fragile peace of a quiet afternoon at Los Angeles International Airport. Before any of it began, Ethan Cole was just another weary traveler among thousands rushing to get somewhere. 45 years old, tall with silver at his temples, and the calm gaze of a man who had seen hundreds of deals but never lost his composure. He wore a charcoal grey blazer, a simple black t-shirt underneath, and polished brown leather shoes. One glance was enough to tell he belonged to the world of disciplined detail and quiet power. Among hundreds of strangers, Ethan wasn't the kind of man people noticed easily, but he was the kind they couldn't forget. He moved through security with deliberate calm, carrying only two things: an espresso brown leather briefcase and a sleek black carry-on. No bodyguards, no assistants, no one hurrying behind him with a laptop or a meeting schedule. That simplicity was precisely what set him apart. The day before, Coltech Systems, the software empire he had founded, had just closed a contract worth more than $200 million with a major bank in Chicago. The press had covered it, his partners had celebrated, but Ethan just wanted to go home back to Seattle, where the sunset stretched like a ribbon of red over the water, back to his apartment overlooking the bay, where he could sit quietly with a glass of wine, and no one would ask, "Would you like anything else, sir?" But he didn't know yet that this flight would be unlike any other. Sometimes fate chooses a seat to test the weight of a person's soul, and today fate chose Seat 1A. The boarding gate for North Star Airlines opened, and the first-class passengers began to file in. Ethan checked his ticket seat, 1A, a small number that for him had become both habit and symbol. For nearly 2 decades he had always sat there first, to board first, to leave near the exit, quiet enough to think and perfect for observation. Few people knew that some of Coltech's multi-million-dollar contracts had been drafted on the tray table of that very seat. Ethan stepped into the cabin. The air inside was different, scented with warm wood and bergamot, the golden light glowing softly over the cream leather seats. He placed his bag in the overhead bin, sat down, and leaned back, releasing a quiet sigh of relief. "Finally some peace," he murmured. Around him, the world seemed to fade into stillness. Only the soft announcements from the crew, the roll of luggage wheels, and the rhythmic click of heels on the carpeted aisle filled the air. For a brief moment, the world was calm. Ethan took out his phone and opened his photo gallery. A picture of his mother appeared standing in her garden in Portland. She once told him, "You don't need to prove that you're great. Just remember, you are never small." Those words had followed him all his life. But in just a few minutes, the world would force him to prove them again, not with words, but with action. "Excuse me, Mr. Cole." A female voice broke the silence, soft but unsteady. Ethan looked up. Standing before him was a young flight attendant, slender blonde hair, tied neatly, her name tag reading Amber. Her smile was polite, but strained her eyes, flickering away. "There's been a small mix-up on the seating list. We'll need you to change seats for another passenger." Ethan frowned. "A mix-up. I booked this seat 2 weeks ago." "Yes, sir. I understand," she replied quickly. "But the other passenger is one of our Platinum VIP members. We hope you can understand." For a moment, he said nothing. His gaze remained calm, but carried the quiet weight of authority. Amber swallowed hard. In that instant, she sensed she had stepped into something far bigger than a technical error. A few rows back, A young man stood leaning casually against the seat, confidence written all over him. His blonde hair was perfectly styled, his white shirt rolled at the sleeves, and a Tag Heuer watch glinted on his wrist under the cabin lights. Ryan Mitchell. He didn't speak, just offered Ethan a faint, knowing smile, the kind that came from years of getting his way. Ethan could feel the unspoken current in the air, the glances, the assumptions. Nobody said it aloud, but everyone understood. A middle-aged black man, dressed simply, and a younger white man who looked like he belonged to the world of privilege. The silence had a scent, the scent of judgment of power that didn't need to be earned because it was assumed. Ethan drew a slow breath, leaning back into his seat, his hand resting lightly on the leather briefcase. "I'm sorry," he said softly, yet clearly, "but I won't be changing seats. This is my ticket, and this is my seat." Amber blinked, her forced smile faltering. "We just want to—" "I understand," he interrupted, gently, his voice low but firm. "You want things to be easier. But sometimes what's easy can be very expensive." The cabin fell silent. A few passengers turned away, others looked down at their phones, pretending not to hear. Yet inside, something shifted, like the ticking of a clock in a crowded room where no one dared breathe. Amber nodded slightly, stepped back, and walked away. Ethan watched her go, not angry, not dramatic, only with the quiet gaze of a man who had long grown used to being judged by his skin rather than his worth. Outside the window, the sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the glass in hues of amber and rose. Ethan closed his eyes. He didn't yet know that this moment, this seat, this question, that fleeting look from a flight attendant, would soon ignite a storm that would make an entire airline bow its head in shame. Because sometimes all a man has to do is sit exactly where he belongs, and the whole system trembles with the weight of its own disgrace. North Star Airlines, flight number 218, was preparing for departure. The first-class cabin had returned to its artificial calm, the kind of stillness that felt like a winter lake, smooth on the surface, but ready to crack beneath the ice. Ethan Cole remained seated in 1A, his gaze fixed on the window. The Los Angeles sunset burned gold and orange across the sky, its reflection stretching along the cabin glass like a slow-moving flame. He stayed silent, his fingers absently twirling a silver pen, a familiar habit whenever his mind began to calculate. Behind him, faint whispers fluttered through the cabin. "What just happened? I think that man refused to change seats. He probably doesn't know that's a platinum VIP." Ethan heard every word, but didn't care. In 25 years of work, he had learned to let contempt pass over him like wind. But this time was different, not because he felt insulted, but because of how normalized the insult had become, how an entire system could treat pushing him out of his own seat as something natural. A man's voice rose from behind, casual but laced with mockery. Someone's giving the staff a hard time. It was Ryan Mitchell, the young man with the charming smile and arrogant eyes. His tone was louder than necessary, meant for everyone to hear. A woman sitting in 1C, older and poised, turned her head sharply toward him. Her voice, calm but cutting, carried just enough for those nearby. Someone needs to relearn their manners. Ryan smirked, shrugged, and slid on his sunglasses, as if to hide the bruise to his pride. Ethan tilted his head slightly, meeting the woman's eyes. For a single second, understanding passed silently between them, the kind shared by two people who had seen enough of the world, one who had lived long enough to know what was right, and one who had endured enough to refuse silence. Outside, the airplane bathed in a crimson sunset as passengers settled into their seats. The chief attendant, Mark Reynolds, a tall man with a stern face, entered the cabin to check the list. His eyes swept across the aisle, pausing briefly on Ethan. There was a flicker of tension, a mix of suspicion and irritation. Amber, the flight attendant from earlier, stood beside him, whispering quietly. Mark nodded, glanced toward Ryan Mitchell, then back at Ethan. That look said everything. This wasn't over. Ethan closed his eyes, drawing a slow breath to steady his pulse, though his heart beat harder than usual, not from fear, but from a familiar wave rising inside the kind of indignation that hid beneath the polite mask of procedure. He remembered a night 15 years earlier, when, as a young engineer, he'd been denied the chance to speak at a conference because he didn't fit the company image. Back then, he'd stayed silent. But today, he was no longer that engineer. Today, he was the man who controlled the systems these people depended on to fly. Amber returned her voice, trembling slightly despite the polite smile on her face. "Mr. Cole, we really need your cooperation. The other passenger has a special request. We can offer you complimentary drinks, a private meal, and an equally comfortable seat." Ethan opened his eyes and looked directly at her. "Do you know why seat 1A is always the first seat?" She hesitated, uncertain. "Because it marks the beginning of the journey," he said quietly. "Just like in business, if you start with the wrong decision, the entire flight goes off course." The words made her falter. She nodded quickly. I'll inform my supervisor." Ethan gave a small nod, saying nothing more. Ryan chuckled under his breath. "What a waste of time. I don't get why the airline's making this a problem. It's just a first-class seat." The elderly woman leaned slightly toward him. "You're right, it's just a first-class seat, but you have no idea how much respect is worth." Ryan's smile vanished. He turned away, but a few passengers began to look at Ethan differently now, not with pity, but with respect. Mark stepped forward, his tone clipped and firm. "Mr. Cole, I'm the chief attendant. If you refuse to comply with the seat change request, the flight will be delayed, and that will be your responsibility." Ethan looked up, his eyes dark and steady. "Mr. Reynolds, if your airline chooses to delay a flight because a man refuses to accept unfair treatment, then perhaps your company needs to rethink the meaning of the word responsibility." Mark froze. The entire cabin fell silent. A few passengers held their breath. Some looked down, ashamed for the ones wearing the uniform. Amber stepped closer, speaking softly. "Sir, we don't want this to become a scene," Ethan replied quietly, his voice sharp and smooth, like a blade over water. "Then don't make it something shameful." The air thickened. Mark glanced at Ryan, then at Amber, before finally stepping back. "Fine. We'll handle this differently." He turned and walked away, pulling Amber with him. Ryan slumped into seat 3, a frustration written across his face, his sunglasses barely hiding the defeat in his eyes. The elderly woman leaned toward Ethan and smiled. "You just did the rightest thing I've seen all year." Ethan smiled faintly. "I just stayed in my rightful seat." The plane began to taxi slowly toward the runway as the daylight faded. Ethan turned to the window and watched Los Angeles shrink beneath the burning sky. A faint breeze slipped through the narrow vent, rustling the magazine in his lap. The page opened on a bold headline, "Respect is the first step of leadership." He stared at those words for a long time. A thin smile appeared on his face, calm but razor-sharp. Because Ethan knew what had just happened wasn't merely an incident. It was a test of dignity, and this airline had failed miserably. As the aircraft lifted off, Ethan closed his eyes, letting his body sink into the seat. The engines roared, echoing through the fuselage like the growl of a machine powered by authority. But inside him, another kind of power was awakening, silent, cold, precise. The storm hadn't come yet, but the sky had already changed. And when it did break, it wouldn't be the wind that roared. It would be an entire system trembling before the man who had once been asked to give up his seat. If silence was the surface, then right now, beneath it, the first wave had already begun to break. The North Star Airlines jet sat on the runway as the sunset poured through the windows, painting the first-class cabin in a golden glow. Yet the light wasn't warm enough to chase away the chill that crept through the air. Ethan Cole could feel it, the heaviness, as if someone had opened an invisible door and let privilege slip in to take its seat among everyone else. The sound of leather shoes echoed through the aisle, steady, confident, and deliberate. A young man stepped in, Ryan Mitchell walking like someone used to being welcomed. He removed his sunglasses and looked around the cabin as if it were his private stage. A smirk crossed his lips when his eyes landed on seat 1A, where Ethan was sitting. This must be a mistake, Ryan said, his tone light but edged with arrogance. I always sit there. Amber, the blonde flight attendant, rushed forward, her voice dropping, as if she feared losing points in his eyes. Yes, Mr. Mitchell, we're sorting it out. Please have a seat in row 3 while we make the adjustments. Ryan nodded, though his eyes stayed on Ethan. Not hateful. Not loud, just natural. The kind of natural that comes when someone looks at something they've always had, now suddenly held by someone else. Ethan said nothing. He opened the magazine on his tray table, eyes on the page, though his heartbeat had already slowed the rhythm of a man who knew exactly what kind of moment he was about to face, one he'd seen too many times, but never learned to accept. A few other passengers glanced around, sensing the tension in the air. A grey-haired man in row 2 shook his head and whispered to his wife. Another seat priority issue. She replied softly. Maybe that man has some kind of platinum card. Platinum doesn't replace justice, he said quietly. The words dropped into the air like a spark touching gasoline in a cabin waiting to ignite. Amber turned back, forcing a polite smile toward Ethan. Mr. Cole, Mr. Mitchell has been a very loyal premium customer. I'm sure you can understand. Understand that it allows him to take someone else's seat. Ethan looked up, his voice calm but sharp. Amber swallowed, stepping back half a pace. No, I just want to avoid making a scene. Ethan closed the magazine and set it on the table. You know, the most shameful things often start with someone trying to avoid making a scene. A few passengers smiled faintly. His voice wasn't loud, but it was clear enough that no one could pretend not to hear. Ryan let out a soft laugh and turned to Amber. It's fine, Amber. I get it. Some people just aren't used to seeing others treated specially. Ethan turned his head, his eyes cutting like glass. No, I'm used to it. I'm just not used to disrespect. The reply made Ryan freeze for a heartbeat. The smirk faded from his face. Amber lowered her head, her voice trembling. Gentlemen, please don't. But before she could finish, the older woman in 1C misses. Helen spoke up, her voice firm and resonant, the sound of a gavel striking a desk. This man doesn't need to give up his seat. He's sitting exactly where he belongs. If the airline wants to move someone, move the other one. The cabin erupted. Some murmured in agreement, others glanced around nervously. Chief Attendant Mark Reynolds appeared again, his composure gone. He leaned forward, voice clipped. Mr. Cole, I need your cooperation. This is a directive from operations. Ethan met his eyes calm and cold. Your operations are asking a paying passenger to leave his seat just to please another. Do you find that reasonable? Mark frowned, avoiding his gaze. Sir, if you don't comply, we'll have to delay the flight. Ethan leaned back, his voice steady and unnervingly calm. If protecting my right to my own seat keeps this plane from taking off, then maybe it shouldn't to fly. The sound in the cabin vanished. Only the hum of the air conditioning and the rustle of luggage remained. Ryan turned, impatience creeping into his tone. Come on, man. Don't make this a big deal. I take this flight every week. 1A's my seat. It even has my name on it. It's like tradition. Ethan smiled slightly. Funny because today that tradition changes. Ryan started to respond, but stopped when he noticed several passengers watching him with disapproval. A man in row 2 muttered just loud enough to be heard. He bought the ticket, he sits there. It's that simple. Mark switched tactics. He motioned to Amber. Call ground supervision. Amber hurried down the aisle. The air grew heavy, every second stretching into eternity. Ethan turned to the window. Outside, the sky still burned orange, but inside all warmth seemed to fade. Something within him, the part that had stayed quiet too long, began to stir. No more tolerance. No more letting it slide. Only clarity remained. The cabin door opened, and a man in a grey suit stepped in. Supervisor Blake, the airline's ground manager. He approached with that familiar professional service smile, voice loud, steady, and falsely calm. Mr. Cole, we sincerely apologize for the inconvenience, but since Mr. Mitchell is one of our elite platinum passengers, the airline has assigned Seat 1A to him under internal policy. We'd appreciate your cooperation in moving. Ethan turned his head slowly, his tone dropping low. You just said internal policy. I've never seen any rule that allows you to push a paying passenger out of his seat, unless of course you think my skin is your policy. A wave of silence spread through the cabin. Amber lowered her head. Mark looked away. Blake's smile froze, faltering. Ethan continued his voice, even every word falling like a stone into still water. I am a customer. I bought my ticket. I followed your process. And now I'm being publicly humiliated in the name of your so-called internal priority. Mrs. Helen spoke again, this time louder, clear as a bell. This man is right. You're humiliating a customer in front of everyone. This isn't service, it's discrimination. Passengers began to nod, whispers rising in support. Blake's expression hardened as he tried to hold his authority. Sir, if you refuse to comply, we'll have to ask you to leave the aircraft. Ethan stared at him, unblinking. Then go ahead. But make sure your airline understands the cost of removing the wrong man. His voice was low, but its weight froze the entire cabin. Blake stiffened, swallowed his pride, and stepped back. Fine, stay in your seat. We'll deal with this later. He turned sharply and walked off Mark and Amber, following behind, leaving the cabin thick with tension. Ryan sat still, forcing a smirk, though his hand clenched tightly on the armrest. Ethan turned back to the window. The last light of the sun was fading. Inside him, there was no anger, only a cold, focused calm. Because he knew every moment of this had been witnessed by the eyes of dozens of passengers and by the memory of the man they had tried to humiliate. One day they would remember this moment when they tried to push a man from his seat, not realizing he was the one who held the fate of their entire system in his hands. The air inside the first-class cabin thickened like a wall. A long minute of silence, followed the kind of silence that carried the taste of shame, power, and fear. Ethan Cole remained seated in 1A, his eyes on the window, but every sense in his body was pulled tight like a string. He knew they would come back. People like them never surrendered quietly. And just as he expected, less than 5 minutes later, the cabin door opened. 3 people stepped in. Amber, her face tense. Mark, still trying to look authoritative, but unable to meet his eyes. And behind them, Supervisor Blake, the ground operations manager, this time accompanied by a security officer in a black uniform. The sound of their shoes striking the floor made several passengers look up. It felt like an internal disciplinary act being performed under the bright lights for everyone to see. "Sir, I'll be direct." Blake began, his voice steady but carrying a faint tremor. "If you refuse to cooperate, we will have to ask you to leave the aircraft. This is a directive from upper management." Amber stood behind him, her eyes red, perhaps realizing this had gone far beyond the limits of any procedure. Ethan turned his head, unnervingly calm. "I've made myself clear. I have a ticket. I'm sitting in the seat I paid for." Blake folded his arms, forcing a stiff smile. "Mr. Mitchell is a special client. This seat is reserved for him under our elite priority program." A sigh escaped from row 2. A middle-aged man shook his head and spoke clearly. "No one has the right to remove a paying passenger from their seat. I used to be an aviation lawyer, and this is completely wrong." The murmurs began spreading. A young woman in row 3 whispered, "This is shameful." Another man muttered, "They're doing something indefensible." Blake's patience was slipping. He turned to the security officer, his tone hardening. "Prepare to escort this passenger off the plane." Ethan slowly rose to his feet. The entire cabin fell silent. He wasn't much taller than Blake, but his gaze made the other man seem small. "You really want to do this?" Ethan asked quietly in front of everyone. Blake said nothing. "You want to show them?" Ethan continued, "That to your company. A platinum card is worth more than a person's dignity." Amber inhaled sharply, tears welling in her eyes. "Sir, please don't," she tried to say, but Blake raised his hand to stop her. "You don't need to interfere." A sharp female voice cut through the tension. "He's right." Everyone turned. It was Mrs. Helen, the elderly woman in 1C, standing tall, one hand braced on the seat in front of her eyes, blazing. "You're humiliating this man in public, just because he doesn't fit your idea of a VIP." A few passengers began to echo her words. "She's right. He paid for that seat. Leave him alone." The voices grew louder, stronger, a wave of defiance rolling through the cabin. Blake faltered, trying to regain control. "Please remain calm, everyone. This is an internal matter for the airline." Ethan looked around, his voice cutting through the noise, clear and firm. "No, this is a matter of justice, and justice is never internal." His words silenced the room. For a long moment, there was nothing but the faint whine of wind brushing against the fuselage. Blake's face tightened, a flicker of anger flashing in his eyes. But then he saw the glow of cell phones several passengers had begun recording. He froze, as though he had just collided with the wall of truth. "Very well," he said, finally forcing a smile. "We'll file a report about this incident. For now, please remain quiet for the duration of the flight." He turned sharply, gesturing for Mark and Amber to follow. They disappeared behind the cabin curtain. When the door closed, the sound of heavy breathing filled the air. A few passengers clapped softly. Helen sat down again, smiling at Ethan. They thought they could humiliate someone in front of a crowd and still be safe. But they forget that in silence, the audience becomes the judge. Ethan smiled faintly, and answered softly, "Thank you, Mom. But I don't need justice from others. I'll make it myself." She looked at him, a spark of curiosity in her eyes. "You talk like someone who actually has the power to do that." Ethan turned toward the window, his voice calm. "I do." The plane took off slowly. Outside, the sky darkened as the lights of Los Angeles shrank beneath the wings. Inside, the air was still thick, heavy with what had just happened. No one spoke. Ryan Mitchell sat in row 3, staring straight ahead, his lips pressed tight, the arrogance drained from his face. Ethan opened his laptop. The blue light from the screen reflected across his features. An unsent email glowed on the screen subject line already written, "Recontract renewal with North Star Airlines urgent review." He reread the contents lines of code data models and technical metrics, the kind of language only people like him could truly understand. Coltech Systems, his company controlled North Star Airlines' entire core infrastructure, flight scheduling, crew assignments, maintenance tracking, routing supervision. If those systems went down, the airline wouldn't be able to operate for hours, maybe even days. Ethan stared at the screen for a moment, his hand hovering over the keyboard, then quietly closed the laptop. Not yet. Not up here. But soon, once they were back on the ground. The plane leveled off at 30,000 feet. Amber made one last pass through the cabin. As she reached row 1, she paused. "Mr. Cole," she said softly, "I really am sorry." Ethan looked up, his eyes gentler now. "I don't blame you. Some people are just doing their jobs, but others like your superiors are doing the opposite." Amber lowered her head, her voice breaking slightly. "I know, and I hope one day they learn how to apologize properly." Ethan nodded slowly. "That day will come sooner than you think." The cabin lights dimmed, passengers began to drift into sleep. But in the front row, the man in 1A stayed awake, the light from his phone illuminating his face, calm, cold, and quietly relentless. On the screen, a single message had just been sent. "Lucas, check the entire contract with North Star first thing tomorrow. I want a list of their competitors." At the end of the message was a single period, a period that closed one flight and opened a new battle, a reversal of power that North Star Airlines would never forget. At 30,000 feet, surrounded by the vast night sky, Ethan Cole slowly closed his eyes. He wasn't triumphant. He wasn't angry. He felt only one thing, the stillness of a man who had already made his decision. Because sometimes justice doesn't need to shout. It only needs to sit exactly where it belongs and wait for the landing. North Star Flight Number 218 touched down on the Seattle runway beneath a pale purple sunset. The landing gear screeched, shaking the cabin, then slowly quieted. In that moment, many passengers exhaled in relief, but for Ethan Cole, this was only the beginning. He remained seated, waiting for others to stand and gather their belongings. No one spoke to him, but almost everyone looked at him, not with pity, but with quiet respect. As Ethan reached up to pull his suitcase from the overhead compartment, Mrs. Helen, the elderly woman who had defended him, gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "You've made me believe," she said softly, "that there are still people brave enough to stay seated for what's right." Ethan smiled, his eyes kind. "Thank you, Mom. But sometimes, to stay seated, a person must first stand up inside." She nodded slightly before walking away. The hallway lights reflected off the polished floor, casting Ethan's silhouette, solitary but steady as stone. Ahead of him, Ryan Mitchell walked briskly, not daring to look back. The embarrassment on his face said more than any apology could. As he passed, Ethan looked at him quietly, without anger or contempt, only with the calm understanding of someone who knew that consequences didn't come from rage, they came from the system. Outside the airport, the Seattle air was cold and damp. A black sedan waited at the curb. Frank, his driver of nearly 10 years, greeted him with a respectful nod. "Welcome back, sir." "Was the flight all right?" Ethan gave a faint smile. "We landed safely, and that's enough." He settled into the back seat as the golden glow of highway lights brushed across his face. The cityscape drifted by through the window buildings, neon signs and street lights sliding past like a slow-motion reel. Ethan stayed silent, but his mind replayed every detail of the flight: Amber's trembling voice, Ryan's smirk, Blake's cold threats, and the strangers' voices rising to defend him. Each sound merged into one precise, unforgettable scar. At his penthouse, overlooking Elliott Bay, warm light reflected off the dark wooden floors. Ethan set down his suitcase, removed his watch, and poured himself a glass of bourbon. The amber liquid shimmered under the lamp like a memory. He took a slow sip and sat in his leather chair. His phone lit up on the table. 3 new emails. One from Lucas Grant, Coltech's Chief Operating Officer. The subject line read, "Phoenix deal closed. Congrats, boss." Another from the board committee. "Welcome back, Ethan." And the last one, an automated message from North Star Airlines. "Thank you for flying with us. Please share your experience." Ethan smiled a thin but cold smile. "Experience," he murmured. "All right, I'll share it, but not through a survey." He opened his contacts and called Lucas. The phone rang twice. "Lucas here. You still at the office?" "Yeah, just finishing up with the Phoenix software review. What's up tomorrow? I want a full review of the North Star Airlines contract. Every clause term, appendix, and backup data." Silence hung on the line for a few seconds. "All right," Lucas replied slowly. "What do you want me to prepare for?" Ethan took another sip, his eyes fixed on the fog-covered skyline beyond the glass. For a recalibration of priorities. Hanging up, he opened his laptop. The system control panel appeared streams of code maintenance schedules, flight routes, crew assignments, all under Coltech's infrastructure. Every line of data was a bloodstream, and he was the heart that kept it alive. He zoomed in on a section labeled Service Tier Priority Clients. North Star sat in second place. One simple click and it dropped to the very bottom. The sound of the click was dry and sharp like a gavel striking wood. The next morning, 6:30 in the morning, Coltech headquarters. The massive glass tower gleamed in the light of dawn. Ethan walked in, wearing a perfectly tailored black suit, calm and composed as if nothing had happened the night before. Lucas was already waiting in the conference room. "You're early," he said, his hand resting on a thick folder. "I couldn't sleep," Ethan replied, his voice slightly rough. "Let me see it." Lucas slid the folder toward him. "The North Star contract expires in December. They're preparing a 5-year renewal proposal. If we don't renew, they'll be in crisis. Their entire operations rely on Coltech's platform." Ethan turned each page slowly, his eyes scanning the fine print. How long would it take them to feel it if we lowered their service priority? Lucas shrugged. "Less than 72 hours. Ethan nodded slightly and set the papers down. "Then let the countdown begin." Lucas studied him for a moment, curiosity flickering in his eyes. "Does this have something to do with your flight yesterday?" Ethan was silent for a moment before answering quietly. "Yes, but not because they insulted me, because they think they can insult anyone." He stood and walked toward the window. The early light cut across his face, sharp as steel. "Lucas, do you know why I built Coltech? To make the world run more efficiently?" "No. To teach the powerful that every system has someone truly in control. And that person isn't the one sitting in seat 1A. It's the one who knows when to stand up from it." Lucas said nothing. There was something in Ethan's tone that sent a chill down his spine. Before leaving the room, Ethan added his voice, calm but final. "From today, no one gives North Star priority. No expedited support, no after-hours responses, no exceptions. Let them feel what it's like to be treated as second class." Lucas nodded slowly. "Understood, sir." Ethan paused at the door and turned back. "And remember, don't contact them first. I want them to be the ones who call us." Morning light washed over Seattle's skyline. Ethan stepped onto the balcony, looking down at the city below. Streets filled with movement, people rushing to work, car horns echoing through the chill air. He took a deep breath, the cold wind filling his lungs. For the first time in years, his heart felt light. Not because he had taken revenge, but because he had held his ground and made an entire system learn to respect it. Downstairs, Lucas watched Ethan's silhouette fade into the morning light. He didn't know exactly what had happened on that flight, but he knew one thing for certain. Whenever Ethan Cole went quiet, the rest of the world paid in noise. 3 days later. The morning in Seattle was grey and damp, the clouds hanging low like a blanket of lead pressing down on the sky. Inside Coltech Systems, however, the atmosphere was brighter than ever, bright with control, absolute and unquestioned. In the office on the 40th floor, Ethan Cole stood before the vast glass wall, a cup of coffee still steaming in his hand. Beneath him, the city pulsed with life, the streams of traffic like veins pumping through a giant body. But in his mind, there was only one body left, struggling to breathe, North Star Airlines. The door opened, and Lucas Grant stepped in his face, a mixture of excitement and tension. "You should hear this," he said, holding out his phone. Ethan set his coffee down, his voice calm. "It's begun, hasn't it?" Lucas switched on the speaker. A frantic male voice crackled through, distorted by urgency. "We're having a serious issue in the data center. The flight schedules are out of sync. Crew assignments are wrong. Dozens of flights are delayed, and the system isn't responding the way it used to. What's happening over there?" Ethan listened quietly, his expression unreadable. Lucas glanced at him, waiting. Finally, Ethan spoke just one line. "The domino effect has started." On the other end of the call, the North Star supervisor's voice grew more desperate. "We've sent an emergency support request, but we haven't heard back from your tech team. They used to fix things in 15 minutes, and now it's been 4 hours, Lucas replied smoothly, as if discussing the weather. "We're following the contract precisely response time within 8 business hours. There was a pause, followed by a gasp of disbelief. 8 hours? Are you joking? Our entire airline is about to shut down." Lucas gave a small, polite smile. "I'm sorry." "Rules are rules." Ethan picked up his cup again and took a slow sip. "Lucas," he said, "log the exact time of this call. I want to know the precise moment they began to understand the cost of disrespect." Over the next 2 days, whispers spread quietly across the aviation industry. North Star pilots complained on internal forums. "Crew scheduling system keeps crashing. The flight management app won't update. Maintenance rosters are scrambled. Dozens of flights are grounded." Inside North Star's operations rooms, department heads began blaming one another. Leaked reports reached the press root cause, identified as delayed responses from software partner Coltech Systems. That name Coltech began to echo through the industry like a curse, but no one dared reach directly for Ethan. They all knew that if he wished, their entire system could stop breathing before noon. In Coltech's control center, engineers continued their work as if nothing unusual was happening. They were simply following procedure, no faster, no slower. But every line of code they typed, every ticket they left pending, was another incision into North Star's heart. Lucas approached Ethan and spoke quietly. "Competitors are calling. Horizon Air and Delta Vista want to meet about switching to our system. Seems like they've heard North Star's in trouble." Ethan nodded, his eyes sharp as glass. "Then treat them like royalty. I want North Star to realize that what they took for granted is exactly what others are willing to kneel for." That afternoon, the first call came in. The screen lit up North Star Operations Director. Ethan stared at it, letting it ring 3 times before answering. "Mr. Cole, this is David Miller, Operations Director at North Star. We've noticed a change in the response speed from your technical team. Is there any reason for this?" His tone strained tight like a drawn wire. Ethan leaned back in his chair, speaking slowly. "Nothing's changed. We're following the service level in your contract standard support. No special priority." "You used to respond in minutes," David snapped. "And you used to know how to treat your customers." Ethan replied, his voice cool as ice. "I suppose things change together." Silence filled the line, broken only by the faint sound of air through the speaker. David's voice dropped. "Mr. Cole, I don't understand what you mean." Ethan smiled faintly. "You will." Then he ended the call. Lucas, sitting across from him, let out a quiet laugh. "You just gave them a lesson without saying a word." Ethan shook his head. "No, Lucas. I didn't teach them. I simply showed them the cost of arrogance." 2 days later, financial headlines began to appear. Business Weekly reported North Star Airlines faces severe technical disruption, dozens of flights cancelled, internal disarray, stock drops 6%. Aeronet added, sources confirm the crisis stems from growing tensions with software provider Coltech Systems. Through it all, Ethan Cole remained silent. No statements, no public appearances. He simply sat in his office watching streams of system data on the screen like a surgeon observing a patient struggling for breath. That evening, rain lashed the city. Ethan left the office late. In the car, the radio crackled with the news. North Star Airlines apologizes to passengers for system outages and promises to resolve the issue as soon as possible. Ethan chuckled softly, not with joy, but with the bitter taste of truth. A public apology, yet not a single word to him. He picked up his phone and sent a short message to Lucas. "Do not reply to their emails. Let them figure out why." That night in his penthouse, overlooking the bay, Ethan sat by the window, watching the rain fall. Droplets splattered against the glass, spreading, merging, and fading like traces of pride being washed away. He recalled the flight, Blake's cold stare, Ryan's smirk, Amber's trembling voice. They thought he was just a passenger, but he had never been just a passenger. He was the one flying the plane they were sitting on. They just didn't know it. Ethan closed his eyes and exhaled softly. "No need to strike back with words," he murmured. "All that matters is they learn that respect is not a service. It's the foundation of every system." Outside, a flash of lightning tore through the sky, a blade of light announcing what was to come. A storm was coming, not from the clouds, but from the man who had decided it was time to teach an entire corporation how to bow. Day 8. North Star Airlines headquarters, Denver. 7 in the morning, but the building was already blazing with light like an anthill struck by a stick. On the 18th floor, David Miller, the operations director, stood in the middle of a crowded conference room. The main screen flashed with dozens of bright red alerts. System error, sync failure, delay warning. This was no longer a few delayed flights. The entire system was collapsing. "We've lost control. One department," head shouted, voice trembling. "The flight schedules are scrambled. The crews aren't receiving confirmations. Data isn't syncing. Everything's moving like it's stuck in sand." David slammed his hand on the table. "Call Coltech demand. Immediate action." A young staff member stammered, "We already did yesterday. They said they're processing within standard business hours." The room fell silent. Standard, that word hit like a slap. Everyone in the room knew that Coltech had never made North Star wait more than 10 minutes before. Now 10 hours had passed with no reply. David clenched the pen in his hand, forcing himself to sound composed. "Fine. If their technical team won't act, I'll call their CEO myself." A team lead hesitated. "You mean Ethan Cole?" "Yes." "Video call. Now." The room went still. No one said it aloud, but everyone understood that call would not be simple. Not because Ethan Cole was powerful, but because he was the man their airline had publicly humiliated. In Seattle, Ethan Cole stood in his office, reviewing the weekly report. No expression, no rush. Outside the window, rain fell in steady rhythm, matching his heartbeat. Lucas entered holding an iPad. North Star's calling. Ethan looked up, his eyes cold as steel. "Put them on hold for 5 minutes." Lucas smiled faintly. "You really want them to taste waiting?" "No," Ethan replied calmly. "I want them to learn that respect is taught through time." 5 minutes later, the call connected. David Miller appeared on screen looking exhausted, his collar damp with sweat. "Mr. Cole," he began, his voice tight but measured. "We need to discuss an urgent technical issue. Our system is facing severe disruptions." Ethan leaned back in his chair, speaking evenly, almost lightly. "I've read the news. Seems like you're in the middle of a technological storm." David tried to smile, but it twisted into a grimace. "We need full support from Coltech. Everything's at a standstill, and we know only your team can fix it." "And you expect that for free?" Ethan asked, his tone laced with dry irony. "No, of course not. We're willing to pay additional fees if necessary." "It's not about money," Ethan said, tilting his head slightly. "It's about principle." David hesitated, his eyes shifting. He knew exactly what was being said, without it needing to be said. "Mr. Cole," he began, his voice softening, "if this is about what happened on the flight last week, I sincerely apologize. On behalf of the entire company, I, Ethan, cut him off, his tone low and deliberate. You have no right to apologize on behalf of your company. The one who should be doing that is your CEO." The room froze. David lowered his head. "Understood. Good," Ethan said. "When she calls, I'll listen. Until then, I believe we're both busy." He ended the call. Back in Denver, chaos erupted. David placed the phone down his hand, shaking. A female assistant whispered, "He hung up on you." He only nodded. "Call CEO Emily Hart." Now. She needs to hear this. 2 hours later, on the top floor of North Star's glass tower, Emily Hart, the company's iron-willed, famously disciplined CEO, was staring at a report showing their losses. Shares had dropped 9%. Hundreds of passengers were posting complaints on social media. The press had begun digging into the escalating conflict with their software supplier. Emily's face was ice. Get Ethan Cole on the line." David looked uneasy. "Ma'am, he's not exactly open to discussion. Then we'll see about that." The call connected. The screen split in two on one side. Emily Hart, tall brown hair, neatly tied back, eyes sharp. On the other, Ethan Cole, sitting upright in a white shirt, calm and composed, as though he had been waiting for this conversation his entire life. "Mr. Cole," Emily began, "I'm the CEO of North Star Airlines. I believe there's been a misunderstanding between our companies." Ethan smiled faintly. "A misunderstanding? I think it's clearer than that. I was asked to give up my seat for someone deemed more important. And now your system can't take off. I call that balance." Emily inhaled slowly, steadying herself. "I acknowledge that what happened on that flight was wrong. I apologize for it." Ethan tilted his head slightly. "Really? Or are you apologizing for your stock price?" The words cut like glass. Emily froze for a moment, then exhaled. "Maybe both." Ethan was silent for a few seconds. His gaze softened slightly, but his tone remained cold. "You know, I'm not angry at the people on that plane. I'm angry at how an organization uses its power to diminish others and assumes no one will remember. But sometimes the ones you diminish are the ones holding your lifeline." Emily's expression flickered to the first sign of vulnerability in her eyes. "What do you want?" she asked quietly. Ethan leaned forward, his gaze fixed through the screen. "Nothing. I just want you to relearn the meaning of respect. But every lesson comes with tuition. Yours is the trust you've already lost." The silence that followed felt heavy enough to fill the room. Then Ethan continued his voice, even deliberate, but weighted like a judge's gavel. "I won't terminate your contract. I'll honor it exactly as written. No sooner, no extra support, no privileges. When it expires, I'll transfer your entire system to your competitor." Emily struggled to keep her voice calm. "If you do that, thousands of my employees will lose their jobs." Ethan replied softly, almost like a whisper. "They're passengers on a flight you're piloting. I'm just the one controlling the radar. You should steer more carefully." The call ended. Emily stared at the blank screen, her eyes hollow. David stepped in quietly. "Is there another way, ma'am?" She looked out the window, her voice barely above a whisper. "No, we're paying the price for one seat." Meanwhile, in Seattle, Ethan stepped out onto his balcony. The rain had stopped. The last clouds dissolved, revealing a sky that was cold but clear. He looked into the distance, where North Star planes still managed to lift off, slow and unsteady. He felt no joy, no triumph, only the quiet peace of a man who had closed a cycle. Because in a world where the powerful believe they fly higher than everyone else, sometimes all it takes is one person refusing to leave their seat to make the entire sky bow its head. 3 weeks later, Seattle. A strangely bright morning after days of rain. Sunlight streamed through the glass walls of Coltech's office, casting golden streaks across the polished wooden floor. The air was calm, almost too calm for a world that had just witnessed an unspoken collapse within the American aviation industry only days before. On Ethan Cole's desk sat a plain white envelope. No postage stamp, no courier mark, just a single handwritten line. To Mr. Ethan Cole, from Emily Hart. Lucas entered, holding a steaming cup of coffee. You should read it. Ethan didn't look up, his eyes still fixed on the computer screen. Another apology, not like the others, Lucas replied quietly. This one feels real. Ethan stopped typing. His hand rested on the envelope, feeling the smooth, cool paper. Something shifted within him, Not curiosity, but that faint stir of conscience searching for the line between reason and compassion. He opened the letter. Dear Mr. Cole, I write this, not as the Chief Executive Officer of North Star Airlines, but as someone who has seen how power can blind us. I have watched the full recording of that flight. I saw the flight attendant's eyes, the passenger's confusion, and your face calm, neither angry nor contemptuous. I realized the most dangerous failure in any system isn't technical. It's when people believe they are bigger than respect. North Star has learned that lesson painfully and at a high price. I do not ask for forgiveness. I only hope you believe that since that day we have begun to change. Emily Hart. Ethan set the letter down. Silence filled the room. Only the faint sound of wind passed through the gap in the window, stirring the white curtain. Lucas asked softly, "What will you do?" Ethan took a sip of coffee, his gaze distant. Nothing. Really, forgiveness doesn't need to be declared, just as justice doesn't need to be spoken. At that same moment, in North Star's Denver headquarters, Emily Hart stood in her office, gazing through the glass. Below the airport was alive again, North Star planes with silver wings taking off one by one. Everything was running smoothly now, but her heart was heavy. Her assistant entered quietly. Ma'am, Coltech has confirmed they won't renew the contract when it expires at the end of the year. Emily nodded faintly, her lips trembling slightly. I know. Should we try to negotiate? She shook her head. No. Some doors once closed should remain closed, so we can stand still and listen to the echo left behind. In Seattle, Ethan spent the afternoon reviewing new projects. Yet in the back of his mind, the letter lingered, each sentence, echoing softly like a memory that refused to fade. At 3 o'clock he closed his laptop, stood and told Lucas, "I'm going for a walk." That afternoon, Seattle glowed with pale sunlight. Golden rays glistened off the bay, reflecting across rows of glass rooftops. Ethan strolled along the waterfront, hands in his pockets, the breeze gentle against his coat. He stopped at a small cafe by the pier. A weathered wooden sign read, "Harbor Brew, since 1978. He remembered this place. At 20, he had worked there as a barista. He remembered wiping tables for men in suits, listening to them talk about investments, shares, and power words that belonged to a world far from his own, a young black man just trying to earn an honest wage. He remembered once being scolded by a customer for serving too slowly. Back then, he had only bowed his head and apologized. Today, he had taught an entire corporation what expectation truly meant. A young waiter brought his coffee. "Thank you," Ethan said with a faint smile. The boy hesitated. "You're Ethan Cole, right?" "The CEO of Coltech." Ethan nodded. "I read about you," the boy said. "They said you made an airline apologize." "Is that true?" Ethan smiled softly. "I didn't make them apologize. I just sat in the seat that was mine." The young man looked puzzled, but smiled politely before walking away. On his way home, Ethan's phone rang. Unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. A low, steady female voice came through. "Mr. Cole, this is Emily Hart." Ethan said nothing. Emily continued, her tone sincere. "I know you received my letter. I'm not calling to negotiate. I just wanted to say, thank you for not destroying us completely." Ethan replied slowly. "I never needed to destroy anyone. I just needed them to remember." "And I will remember," Emily said softly, her voice trembling. "Not because of the consequences, but because of your eyes that day. They made me realize that real power isn't in making people bow. It's in making them look at themselves." Ethan stayed silent for a few seconds, then spoke, his voice low and calm like wind brushing across water. If you understand that, then the lesson is complete. They were both quiet, the only sound the steady rhythm of waves hitting the shore. "Mr. Cole," Emily said gently, "may I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "If you could go back to that day, would you still sit in seat 1? Ethan chuckled softly. "No, I'd sit anywhere they told me to, as long as they saw me as a person. But sadly, the world only learns respect after loss." Silence again. Then Emily said softly and honestly, "Thank you for making us look back." The call ended. That night, rain returned to Seattle. Ethan sat by the window, his fingers tapping lightly against the wooden desk. On it lay Emily's letter, the envelope edges slightly worn, as if he had read it many times. He didn't keep it out of regret, but as a reminder that even those who stand at the top can learn humility if they're brave enough to look down. Outside, raindrops traced glowing paths down the glass, catching the city lights like threads of gold. Ethan looked out, watching, as a North Star plane lifted into the sky, leaving a thin trail of smoke behind. He murmured softly, almost to himself, "Fly, and don't forget who taught you how to take off again." Then he closed his eyes. Not to forget, but to remember that sometimes justice doesn't need noise. It only needs one person calm enough to stay in their seat. 3 months later, the story of North Star Flight 218 had grown far beyond the boundaries of a single airline. What was once dismissed as a minor inconvenience had become the year's most powerful lesson in corporate ethics, taught in business schools, discussed at leadership culture conferences, and shared by millions across social media. The photos of Ethan Cole sitting in seat 1A, calm, unshaken, unprovoked, spread everywhere, captioned with the words, "He didn't stand up to fight. He sat still and changed everything." The press called him the man who taught airlines, to Neil the man who made an entire industry relearn respect. But Ethan never gave a single interview. He declined television appearances, refused book deals, and turned down endorsement offers. He simply went to work each day, walking through the glass corridors of Coltech, as if nothing extraordinary had ever happened. At an international technology conference in San Francisco, when his name was announced for the CEO of the Year award, Ethan's speech was brief. "We can build software as intelligent as we want," he said, "but if we forget to code, respect into the system itself, everything will eventually collapse." The audience was silent for a moment, then erupted into a long, thunderous applause. In Denver, North Star Airlines had truly changed. Amber, the young flight attendant who once bowed in desperation, now led the company's new training initiative called Human First. She told the story in every session. Sometimes one person, sitting still, can make an entire industry stand up. On Emily Hart's desk, the framed photo of that first-class cabin sat beneath a silver plaque engraved with the words, "Respect is not policy, it's memory." As for Ethan, he still came to the office every morning, the same routine, the same quiet focus. He no longer thought of that flight as an incident, but as a silent turning point, a reminder that justice doesn't always need to be loud. It only needs one person brave enough not to bow before what's wrong. That afternoon, as he passed by the HR department, he overheard a young employee say to a colleague, "You know, I applied to Coltech just because I wanted to work for the man who sat in seat 1A. Ethan paused at the doorway, said nothing, and simply smiled, because he knew sometimes One silent act can become the voice of an entire generation. One late autumn afternoon, Seattle was bathed in a pale gold light, the fading sun brushing the skyline, while cold mist drifted in from the bay. In the high-rise office of Coltech Systems, Ethan Cole sat alone by the window, gazing at the glittering city below. Under the sunset, Seattle looked like a giant circuit board, every beam of light weaving through the fog like streams of data in motion. And within that vast system, he knew the only thing keeping it from collapsing wasn't technology, it was humanity. On his desk lay the final letter from Emily Hart. No more apologies, no more justifications, only one simple line. Thank you for leaving us with something worth more than any contract our dignity. Ethan folded the letter gently and closed his eyes. Over the years, he had built a technology empire, signed contracts worth hundreds of millions, and worked alongside some of the most powerful people in the world. Yet no moment had etched itself into him as deeply as the day he was asked to give up his seat 1A. It wasn't the day he was insulted. It was the day he truly understood the value of calm. A soft knock at the door broke the silence. Lucas entered, placing a new envelope on the desk. Letter from Stanford University, he said. They want you to join their honorary teaching program topic, Leadership and Ethics in the Age of Data. Ethan smiled faintly. Teaching, I was never a professor. You don't need to be, Lucas replied. You just need to tell your story. Ethan looked out the window. The last rays of sunlight were fading. He spoke quietly. Maybe the world doesn't need more lectures. It needs more people who simply know how to sit still in the right place. That evening, as he walked slowly through the glass corridor on his way out, his reflection overlapped with the lights around him, two versions of the same man. One who had conquered the world with intellect, and one who had conquered himself with dignity. He stopped before a framed photo on the wall, the moment he signed Coltech's first contract 20 years ago. A young man bright-eyed his hands, still trembling. Beneath the photo, a bronze plaque read, "Technology changes the world, but only dignity keeps it from falling apart." Later that night, in his penthouse, overlooking the bay, Ethan stood on the balcony. The sky was filled with stars, and a plane glided across the horizon, leaving a faint silver trail. He smiled softly. It didn't matter whether it was a North Star flight or not. In that moment, he knew they had learned to take off again this time, with wings built from respect. The cold wind brushed past, carrying the scent of salt from the sea. Ethan closed his eyes, inhaled deeply, and rested his hand on the steel railing. No anger, no bitterness, only the quiet peace of a man who knew he had done the right thing. His story did not end with victory, but with awakening. Because in the end, power may make others bow, but only dignity can make the world rise in admiration. From the perspective of an expert in leadership culture and corporate ethics, the journey of Ethan Cole is not merely the story of a first-class seat, but a test of how a person chooses to wield power. He did not use his power to retaliate, but to reflect the way the world treats one another when it believes no one is watching. In the moment he was asked to give up his seat, he did not respond with anger, nor did he fight back with words he resisted with dignity, and that was what made an entire system bow and confront itself. That is the difference between those who hold power and those who lead with purpose. One makes others fear, while the other helps them awaken. In today's world, where prejudice and ego still hide behind every seat and every decision, Ethan reminds us that respect is not a privilege. It is the foundation of civilization. justice does not always come from a courtroom. Sometimes it begins in the moment when an ordinary person dares to say no to what is wrong. If you believe this world needs more people who can stand firm in their dignity, hit like to help spread that message and subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the stories where humanity is tested by power. Because sometimes one person staying in their rightful seat is enough to make the entire world rise for what is right. Before you go, comment below with the words that reflect your belief in that value. Hold your dignity.